This is a story about Mr. Daydream. It's also a story about a little boy called Jack. Now, Jack was a very good little boy. He always ate up all his lunch. He always went to bed when he was told. He always said please and thank you. But Jack was a daydreamer. Whenever he was supposed to be thinking about something, he found himself thinking about something else. Daydreaming. One day, Jack was at school. He was sitting at his desk listening to the teacher talking about history. It was a very warm day, and Jack was glad he was sitting at the back of the classroom next to the open window. Suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw something outside the window on the grass in front of the school. Something blue. It was a small, cloud-shaped figure. The figure smiled and waved. Jack looked at his teacher, who was still talking. Then he got up, quietly, ever so quietly. "Hello," he said. "How are you?" "I'm Mr. Daydream," said the figure. "What's your name?" "Jack," said Jack. "I'm going off on an adventure," said Mr. Daydream to Jack. "Would you like to come with me?" "Oh, yes, please," replied Jack. "Very well, then," said Mr. Daydream, and putting 2 fingers in his mouth, he let out the loudest whistle Jack had ever heard in his whole life. A huge bird swooped down out of the sky and landed beside Jack and Mr. Daydream. "Come on," said Mr. Daydream to Jack, and climbed onto the bird's back. Jack climbed on too. It was a really enormous bird. "Hold on," said Mr. Daydream. Jack held on tight. The huge bird flapped its huge wings, and suddenly they were high up in the air. They flew faster and faster over the countryside. They flew over fields and farms, and towns and hills, and trees and valleys. "How would you like Africa?" he shouted. They were traveling so fast now, Jack just nodded his head and held on even tighter. And they flew across the sea. Suddenly, it seemed in no time at all, there below them was Africa. The bird landed in a jungle clearing, and Jack and Mr. Daydream climbed off the bird's back. "Come on," said Mr. Daydream to Jack. "Let's go and explore." So off they set, pushing their way through the jungle. Suddenly, they saw an elephant. "Hello, Mr. Daydream," trumpeted the elephant down its trunk. "Would you like a lift?" "Oh, yes, please," replied Mr. Daydream. The elephant reached out his trunk, picked him up, and then put him on his back. Then he reached out his trunk again, picked up Jack, and put him on his back. It was very high. Then he set them down on the ground, said goodbye, and went off back into the jungle. "How are we going to cross the river?" Jack asked Mr. Daydream. "Perhaps I can be of assistance," wheezed a particularly oily voice coming from the river. They looked, and there was a crocodile. "Use my back," suggested the crocodile. It was very helpful. They were halfway across the river on the crocodile's back when the crocodile grinned, a rather nasty grin, all teeth and no smile. Then, flicking his enormous tail and shooting Jack and Mr. Daydream up into the air, the crocodile opened his horribly large mouth and waited. It was very frightening. "Oh, dear," gasped Jack as he looked down at that enormous mouthful of teeth. "Oh, dear! Oh, help!" Mr. Daydream, upside down beside him, put 2 fingers in his mouth and let out that very large whistle of his. Suddenly, just as the crocodile's mouth was about to go snap, Mr. Daydream and Jack landed right on the bird's back. "Bother," said the crocodile. "Well, I promised you an adventure, didn't I?" grinned Mr. Daydream. "You certainly did," said Jack. "And now," said Mr. Daydream, "I think Australia." And they did. And Jack learned to throw a boomerang so that it always came back to him. "And now," said Mr. Daydream, "I think we will go to the North Pole." And Mr. Daydream fell right up to his middle in a snowdrift. "And now," said Mr. Daydream, "I think we will go to the Wild West." And Mr. Daydream found a huge 10-gallon cowboy hat. He couldn't see out. "Jack!" he called from underneath the hat. "Jack! Jack!" Suddenly, Jack realized that it wasn't Mr. Daydream saying his name. It was his teacher. And Jack wasn't in the Wild West. He was sitting at his school desk. "Jack," said the teacher again, "you've been daydreaming." It was true. He had. But you know something? Daydreaming is more fun than history.